So the third way that we can store mesh information in ZBrush is by utilizing the 3D layers system. This is different than the layers menu, which is up here at the top on our menu bar. This layer system is for 2.5D illustration layers, more like Photoshop, because these are flat. What we want is the layer system that's located in the tool menu in the layers palette. These layers allow you to record sculpting, painting, and even masking information onto separate layers so that you can isolate them for easier editing. 3D layers are subtool based, meaning that you'll have a different set of layers for every subtool in your list. So I have two versions here of this goblin head. I've got one that is a subdivision mesh that has 4 different levels of subdivision here. And I also have another version of this here, which is still in Dynamesh. So I can show you how you can use the layers and what some of the limitations are with the 3D layers setup. Let's start by just talking about how to use 3D layers. So I'll go down to the layers palette here. And in order to start a layer on record mode, all I have to do is click on this plus button here, and we get a layer up here. And you see that next to it on the right side, we have this record button here. This tells me that this layer is currently in record mode. If I turn this off, now you see that we get an eyeball here. This allows me to turn the visibility of that layer on or off. And this circle icon right here allows me to go back into record mode for this layer. With the layer in record mode, I can now sculpt on my model, and the information that I'm putting down is actually being recorded into this layer. So if I come in and just sculpt some wrinkles in this forehead here, and then go over to the layer and click off on that record, the information that I sculpted while it was in record mode is inside of this layer. So if I turn off the eyeball icon, you'll see that that information disappears. We're left with the model in the state that it was in before I started recording. If I turn the visibility icon back on, then we can see that information that's stored in this layer on our model again. So this brings us to one of the first limitations of using layers. If I have a layer visible, but not in record mode, and I tried to do more sculpting on my model, we get this dialog box that says this mesh has deformation or shape layers active, and the only way to work on the model is to have a layer in record mode. So if I come back over here and I click on record, now I can continue to sculpt on this model. But if I turn off record and I have the visibility of this layer on, I'm unable to sculpt. If I turn off the visibility of the layer, then I can actually sculpt on my model. And if I turn on the visibility of the layer, we see that we still have the information in that layer available to us. But as long as I have any layers visible, I have to work on layers in order to continue sculpting on my model. Now, the information that's being stored in this layer is currently just sculpting information. So if I switch to the paintbrush, and I'll just pick a color here and paint on the model, you'll see that with this layer visible, but not in record mode, I'm still able to come in and paint on the model. But if I have this layer in record mode and I paint on the model and then turn off record mode and try to continue to paint, you'll see that now this says that this mesh has polypaint layers. So the information stored in layers are actually separated. You can have layers that are only sculpting layers, layers that are only polypaint layers, even layers that are only masking layers. Or I can have a layer that stores different combinations of those types. But as long as you have a layer visible that has one of those types of information on it, then in order to put down more paint or sculpting or masking information, you'll need to be in record mode. Another limitation to using the 3D layer system is that 3D layers store vertex information. So if I'm using a Dynamesh model and I want to make a large change, say I want to change the shape of this ear, so I select the move brush and I start to stretch this out a little bit more and maybe give this a little bit more of a point to it. And I end up with a lot of stretched polygons here. If I try to re-Dynamesh my model, I'm going to get this dialog up at the top that says this mesh has layers, so the action is canceled. So I can't Dynamesh my model if I'm using layers. The same holds true for using something like the snake hook brush with Sculptris Pro mode on. If I come in and try to use Sculptris Pro mode, it allows me to use the snake hook brush, but it disables Sculptris Pro mode because Sculptris Pro mode is going to dynamically retopologize my model. So anything that changes the topology of the model won't work if you're using 3D layers. So now I'm on the subdivision version of this model. This mesh has 4 subdivisions currently on it. If I'm at the lowest subdivision level and I go down to layers and I try to create a new layer, I'm going to get this dialog box that says you can only create layers at the highest subdivision level. So I'll simply hit the letter D until I'm at the highest subdivision level. Then it will allow me to create a new layer. Once I'm in record mode, I can go up and down the subdivision levels as I want, and I can make changes at a lower subdivision level. But it's actually storing the information at the highest subdivision level. So if I go back up to my highest subdivision level, this is what's being stored. If I go ahead and turn off the record mode here and then go back down in my subdivisions, you can see that it looks a little bit different at this lower subdivision level than it did when I made it, because it's only storing that information at the highest subdiv level. In fact, if I turn on record mode again and I drop down in subdivision level, you see that I can't access the record controls for my layer. That's because the layer is tied to the subdivision level in which it was created. You can see in the little pop-up dialog that it says untitled layer sdiv4, meaning that this layer was created at subdivision level 4. So if I go back up to subdivision level 4, you can see that I have my controls active again. If I turn off this layer and I hit Control D to create a new subdivision level, now I have 5 subdivision levels here. This layer was still created using subdivision level 4, however. So if I try to go into record mode at subdivision level 5, it won't let me. I have to drop down 1 level and then I can go into record mode for this particular layer. However, if I want to create a new layer and I try to create it at subdivision level 4, it'll say it requires the highest subdivision level to create a layer. So now I have to go up 1 level to subdivision level 5. Now I can create my new layer. And you can see that this one says untitled layer sdiv5 instead of untitled layer sdiv4. If I want to rename a layer, all I have to do is go down to the name button down here, click on it, and I can name it whatever I want. If I want to delete a layer, all I have to do is click on this delete button here, and it will delete that layer. Let's rename this top layer here. I'll just rename it to test. Now you may have noticed that there's a slider connected to every layer that you create. This slider is your opacity slider. This allows you to modify the strength of the information that is stored on that layer. I can actually drop this not just down to 0, but also down into the negative if I need it. Down at the bottom is a global opacity control that will control all of the layers. Right now I only have 1 layer, so these two have the same value set to them. With the global opacity layer, I can actually also overcrank the opacity beyond what it was when I created that layer. Another way I can increase the strength of a layer is by duplicating it. That button is located next to the name button here. If I duplicate a layer, then its effect is going to be doubled. I still have the sliders here, so if I want a little bit less from the duplicate layer, I can adjust it here. So let's say I make an adjustment to this duplicate layer, and I want to merge these layers together so that I don't have these duplicates. What I can do is select the top layer, we'll set that back to 1, and then I can click this Merge Down button here. When I do that, now those two layers have been merged together and the opacity value has been set to 1. I can then come in here and adjust the opacity of this layer. And if I want to bake these changes into my model so that I'm no longer working in layers, all I have to do is go down to the Bake All button down here. And that will bake all of the visible layers into my mesh. Now I can sculpt on this without having layers active. So if I have a layer that has both sculpting and painting information on it, I can separate those two things out into their own separate layers. All I have to do is turn off record mode and then go down underneath the name button here. There's this split layer button. When I click that, it will separate the layers into their respective types. My first layer at the top is my sculpting layer, where all my sculpting information is. And below that is my polypaint layer. If I turn off the visibility on my paint layer, you can see that that information disappears. So let's take a look at a few different ways that you can utilize layers to make your sculpting and painting process easier. The first way I'll show you is using layers to separate out different levels of detail. So let's start off by creating a new layer, and I'm going to use this layer to create sort of granular level pore texture and fine wrinkle texture. Let's take the standard brush, and I'm going to change the stroke type to this spray stroke right here. Then let's go ahead and pick a really small alpha, say this alpha 40, and I'm going to reduce the Z intensity quite a bit and change this from Z add to Z sub. Now what I can do is come in here and change the size of my brush and spray down some initial pores. I can also make this larger and hold down Alt to put down some bumps on the surface. Let's change the alpha now to alpha 60, and we'll lower the Z intensity a little bit more and make this a little bit larger, and then we'll just come in and lightly spray in some fine wrinkles into the forehead as well. And then let's go ahead and change this. I think I'll pick alpha 8, and we'll just add a little bit of turbulence using this alpha. So now that I have this sort of granular texture in here, I'm going to go ahead and add a new layer, and I'm going to go ahead and switch to the Damien standard brush, B, D, and S. And now what I'm going to do is start to sculpt in some of the larger wrinkles that you get from expressions and aging. And let's say I make some of these marks and I don't really like what I'm getting, but I don't want to undo back because there's other marks in there that I like quite a bit. What I can do is I can turn off the visibility on my granular texture layer. Then I'll turn record back on for my wrinkle layer, and then I can smooth out any parts that aren't working for me. I can even continue to sculpt with just the wrinkle layer active. And if I turn on the visibility on my pore texture layer, you can see that all of the pore texture has been protected. So using layers to separate out your detail can allow you to make corrections without destroying some of the fine granular stuff that would be wiped out if I couldn't hide it while making corrections to the larger wrinkles. This kind of thing works especially well if you also store a morph target. So I'm going to turn off the visibility on both of my layers so that I just have my base model without any details visible. Then I'm going to go down to Morph Target, and I'm going to click Store Morph Target. Now if I go back up here and turn on the visibility here, let's turn on Record for my wrinkle layer, and let's come in and make some deeper creases in the forehead here. Now let's say I don't like some of the wrinkles that I've made in here. What I can do is click on Record here, turn off the visibility on my pores, turn Record back on for my wrinkle layer, and then switch to the Morph brush by hitting B, M, and G. And now I can come in, and instead of smoothing, I can actually just morph back to that stored morph target state. This gives you a much cleaner result than smoothing would. Then when I'm finished making my corrections, I can turn off Record, turn back the visibility on my pore texture, and then continue sculpting the wrinkles on my wrinkle layer. Another great use of layers is to store expression or pose information. So let's go ahead and create a layer here, and I'm just going to use the Move brush and drop down a few subdivision levels and make a simple expression for this character here. Then I'll go back up my subdivision levels and turn off Record for this layer. And now I'll make another layer and tilt the head a little bit. So again, I'm going to drop down subdivision levels, and let's use the mask lasso to mask off the head here, and we'll blur this mask several times and flip the mask, and then we'll use our gizmo to pose the head a little bit. And once I've got the pose basically where I want it, I'll clear the mask, go back up my subdivision levels, and then turn off Record on my layer. Now I've got two layers. One has got expression and the other has some pose information. I can turn off either one of these layers. You'll notice that when I posed, I moved the eyeballs with the head using this multi-select button at the top of the gizmo here. If I wanted the eyes to have their own pose layer, I can do that using a plugin called Transpose Master. But we'll be covering Transpose Master a little bit later. For now, if I wanted the eyes to have both a posed and a neutral position, I would have to do that by going up to the subtools and clicking on the eyes here, then duplicating this, going back to this subtool that I originally posed the eyes in, and then go back in my undo history. Now I have a set of eyes that are in pose and a set of eyes that are in neutral position. If I go back to my model now, I can adjust the amount of expression in the expression layer, and I can also adjust the pose. Again, the eyes are not going to move with it because the eyes are in their own subtool. If I wanted the eyes to move with this, I would have to merge the eyes down into this subtool before adding my layers and starting the expressions and the posing. One more use of layers that we'll discuss here is to use layers to help you iterate an idea. So here I have a set of abstract meshes that I've put together to create a design for an alien head or skull. I've used layers to help me mix and match some different morphs of these shapes, and I can change the amount of strength in each layer to come up with an almost endless number of possible designs. So that's going to finish this chapter on layers. We'll be visiting layers again when we get to the poly paint as well as the posing sections.